Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Sci-fi Stories, and thank you for being here with us today. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our monetization, leaving us without the funds to pay our dedicated staff to live and keep creating these epic tales for you. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or comments below. In the lightless depths of the universe, some graves are not meant to be opened, and some corpses are not truly dead. Out in the freezing void, a scavenging crew stumbled upon a monument of silent suffering. It was a fleet of ghosts, bleeding their artificial hearts dry for 20,000 years to keep a terrifying cosmic horror at bay. And then, out of sheer greed and tragic ignorance, the scavengers knocked on the door. The Volari private salvage vessel, Void Drifter, navigated slowly through a suffocatingly dark expanse of the galaxy recognized by scavengers as the Quantum Graveyard. It was a dead sector, a place where starlight refused to reach and where the cosmic background radiation dropped to an unnatural freezing point. The universe out here was an oppressive ocean of nothingness, making the Volari crew feel terribly insignificant, like fleeting dust motes floating in an endless abyss. But the Volari were a species driven by insatiable commerce and the relentless hunt for forgotten technologies. They ignored the heavy, chilling isolation of the void. They were here solely for scrap. Chief Engineer Xylar stood on the command deck, his multifaceted eyes locked onto the sensor readouts. The ship was moving at a fraction of light speed when the primary alarms suddenly shrieked. The hull groaned violently, structural integrity fields flaring as the Void Drifter slammed into something that simply was not there. The sheer force of the impact threw crew members from their stations. Outside the viewport, there was only the same unbroken blackness. Yet the collision sensors screamed of a massive physical impact. Xylar pulled himself back up to his console, his digits flying across the tactile interfaces. "Reroute all auxiliary power to the primary sensory array," he ordered, his voice echoing sharply in the tense silence of the bridge. "Give me a full gravimetric sweep now. We did not just hit empty space." The telemetry scrolled downward, painting a reality that defied all known astrophysics. The Void Drifter had not struck a rogue celestial body or a dark asteroid. The sensors mapped out a localized anomaly, an artificial gravitational field of terrifying proportions designed specifically to bend ambient light around its spherical perimeter. It was a camouflage bubble, but engineered on a scale that made Xylar feel a cold sweat form. The mass reading concealed behind that invisible wall of bent light was staggering, equivalent to an entire planetary system. "This is not a natural phenomenon," Xylar murmured to the captain, his voice tinged with a mixture of awe and rising dread. "Someone, or something, folded the very fabric of space to hide whatever is inside, and based on the energy decay rates of the outer field, it has been sitting here, burning quietly in the dark for at least 20,000 years. The bridge erupted in a murmur of greedy anticipation. A structure of that magnitude, untouched for 20 millennia, meant technology far beyond Volari comprehension. It meant wealth that could buy entire star systems. Driven by the intoxicating allure of ancient secrets, Xylar bypassed the standard Volari safety protocols. "Charge the forward emitter," Xylar commanded loudly. "Hit the barrier with a concentrated tachyon laser pulse. Let us shatter the glass and see what is hiding inside." A blinding beam of coherent light lanced out from the prow of the Void Drifter. The moment the laser struck the invisible wall, the camouflage field did not just fail. It shattered like a fragile cosmic mirror. A shockwave of displaced spatial distortion rippled outward, violently shaking the salvage ship. As the visual distortion bled away into the vacuum, the true horror and dark majesty of the hidden graveyard was laid bare against the eternal night. There, suspended in the freezing vacuum, floated a monolithic armada. Xylar counted the silhouettes as the tactical overlay struggled to process the sheer volume of the shapes. 400 warships. They were forged from a dark, light-absorbing gray metal, brutally armored and defined by sharp, jagged angles that looked incredibly violent and alien to any known galactic design philosophy. They were imposing, menacing, and utterly devoid of movement. Yet, they were not drifting freely. The 400 dreadnoughts were violently tethered to one another by thick, pulsating chains of blinding red energy. It was not a fleet preparing for a galactic war. It was not an armada pausing in transit. The massive vessels were arranged in a flawless, inescapable circle. They formed a ring of cold steel and burning fire around a terrifying epicenter. In the dead center of the formation lay a spatial rift, a massive artificial tear in reality that resembled a bleeding black hole. The edges of the rift were jagged, convulsing with silent tremors that sent terrifying, invisible ripples through the surrounding space. Xylar stared in absolute bewilderment as the deep scan results flooded his terminal screen. The logic of the scene in front of them was completely inverted. Every single propulsion engine on the 400 ships was stone cold, deactivated millennia ago. However, their primary fusion cores were not dead. They were screaming. The sensors indicated that every reactor in the entire fleet was operating at maximum critical output. They were not using the power to move, nor were they powering life support systems. Every ounce of generated energy was being channeled through those red plasma tethers, funneling inward, pumping directly into the gaping maw of the spatial rift. They had been maintaining this agonizing power output, violently feeding the tear in reality, without a single microsecond of interruption for 20,000 years. The sheer scale of this engineering feat was a heavy, crushing weight on the minds of the Volari crew. The atmosphere on the bridge grew thick with a primordial dread, a visceral understanding that they were looking at a tomb built for gods. But the Volari were scavengers first and sensible beings second. The monumental energy cores alone were worth more than their entire civilization's wealth. Xylar stared fixedly upon the command vessel, anchoring the center of the ring. It was a titan among giants, a dreadnought so massive it possessed its own subtle gravitational pull. Deep inside the Volari ship database, a fragmented translation matrix successfully decoded the ancient script, etched onto the dark dreadnought hull. It read, Aegis Prime. "Take us in," Xylar ordered, his voice trembling with a dangerous mixture of fear and unrelenting greed. "Match rotation with the central command ship. We are boarding the Aegis Prime." The salvage team extended the heavy umbilical docking tube from their vessel, expecting a brutal array of automated defense turrets or highly complex biometric rejection protocols to block their path. The massive outer hull of the dreadnought was an imposing wall of dark metal, scarred by ancient micrometeorites, but otherwise completely impenetrable. Xylar braced his team for a forced entry, preparing the heavy fusion cutters. But as the docking ring clamped onto the primary airlock, the dreadnought systems simply woke up. A deep, resonant mechanical clunk reverberated through the thick plating, vibrating right through the soles of their boots. The airlock did not demand security clearance. It ran a rapid, passive atmospheric scan of the Volari environmental suits, analyzed the standard oxygen and nitrogen mixture, and unlocked. The heavy, interlocking blast doors retracted smoothly into the bulkheads with a sharp hiss of pressure equalization. It was a terrifying realization. The ship was not sealed to keep intruders out. The biological lock was deliberately programmed to welcome absolutely any living, breathing entity that might one day wander into the graveyard. Xylar and his 4-member squad stepped across the threshold, their plasma rifles raised, sweeping the area for threats. But the interior held no horrors of a violent end. There was zero particulate matter floating in the beam of their shoulder-mounted floodlights. There was absolutely no dust, no scorch marks from plasma fire, no barricades, and no skeletal remains scattered in a chaotic final stand. The atmosphere was perfectly sterile and chillingly orderly. The team moved down colossal, cavernous corridors designed for giants. The ambient temperature was hovering just above absolute zero, biting through their thermal layers. The only illumination came from a low-voltage, deep red emergency lighting grid running along the massive baseboards, casting long, distorted shadows across the metal deck. The silence inside the ship was absolute and oppressive. It was so profound that it felt like a physical weight on their chests. The heavy, magnetized footsteps of the Volari scavengers produced dull, rhythmic echoes that seemed to stretch on infinitely down the dark hallways. Yet, beneath that tomb-like silence, they could feel the faint, tectonic vibrations of the monstrous power cores still violently churning deep below decks. As the survey team ventured deeper into the belly of the warship, their lights caught sprawling, intricately etched metal murals covering the massive bulkhead walls. Xylar paused, directing his optical recorder to capture the visual data, allowing his personal translation matrix to process the alien iconography. The vast etchings chronicled the brutal, tragic history of a highly advanced species that identified itself in the text as humanity. The visual narrative was grand and deeply unsettling. It made it terrifyingly clear that this colossal armada, requiring the resources of countless star systems, was never constructed for interstellar conquest, border defense, or colonial expansion. The murals depicted these 400 ships locking together in the void. These ships were forged for one singular, desperate purpose. They were built to be the ultimate cosmic shackle. The humans had engineered their greatest technological achievement merely to become the handcuffs of the universe. Seeking a direct route to the central command bridge, Xylar accessed a localized engineering terminal protruding from the wall. As the tactical schematics of the fleet slowly rendered on his display, his mandibles clicked together in a sudden spike of sheer horror. The dreadnoughts were heavily armed with superparticle cannons, siege weapons mathematically capable of cracking planetary mantles. But every single one of the massive artillery batteries across the entire fleet was facing the wrong way. They were not pointing outward into the open void to repel an invading armada or defend against external threats. They were violently and deliberately angled inward. Every primary weapon barrel was locked in a fixed firing solution, aiming directly back at the spatial rift trapped in the very center of their own formation. The team finally breached the heavy blast doors of the core control center, stepping into a cavernous, multi-tiered amphitheater of ancient technology. Here, the true, devastating cost of this cosmic prison was laid bare, arrayed in perfect concentric circles, stretching out further than their lights could penetrate, were thousands upon thousands of cryogenic stasis pods. Xylar approached the nearest row, wiping a thick layer of frost from the plasteel visor to peer inside. The occupant was completely calcified. The human figure had been turned to literal stone by absolute biological depletion. Moving quickly, Xylar plugged his diagnostic interface into the central mainframes controlling the bay. The readout was a testament to terrifying devotion and absolute sacrifice. The system logs explicitly stated that there had been no catastrophic malfunction. The crew had voluntarily overridden their own life support safety protocols. They had deliberately and systematically drained the bioelectrical energy required to sustain their own cryogenic stasis. They channeled their very life force, dropping their own survival probabilities to zero, just to pump a continuous stream of supplemental power into the energy shield holding the rift closed. They had chosen a slow, petrifying death to ensure the containment field never dropped a single fraction of a percent over 20 millennia. Walking in stunned silence through the endless aisles of the voluntary dead, the salvage squad ascended a steep ramp toward the highest command pedestal overlooking the crypt. At the absolute summit of the dais sat one singular, isolated cryopod. Unlike the thousands of dead chambers below, a faint, Rhythmic blue light pulsed weakly from the base of this unit. Inside the thick, reinforced glass, suspended in a translucent, supercooled cryogenic gel, was a human male. His features were sharp, heavily scarred, and utterly motionless. His dark uniform bore the heavy, unadorned insignia of a supreme commander. The archaic biomonitors flanking the pod indicated an incredibly shallow, artificially slowed pulse. Xylar brushed his heavy, gloved hand against the frost-covered operational terminal at the foot of the chamber. The ancient display flickered to life, cutting through the red darkness with a singular, harsh green line of text. The screen displayed one name, Brant Benitez. The tense silence of the Supreme Command pedestal was abruptly broken by the sharp, impatient clicking of Valari claws against the ancient control terminal. While Xylar was still deciphering the name on the glowing display, his junior technician, driven by the reckless curiosity that often doomed scavengers, ran a heavy digit across a series of unfamiliar tactile relays. He was attempting to slice into the internal memory banks of the cryopod to extract the genetic coding of the human commander. Instead, his clumsy manipulation triggered a catastrophic system override. A harsh, mechanical klaxon blared from the pod base. The faint, rhythmic blue light that had pulsed for 20 millennia instantly turned a violent, flashing amber. The deep hum of the bioelectrical stasis field died with a sickening whine. The technician had just severed the primary energy conduit feeding the suspension gel, initiating a brutal, unsequenced forced revival protocol. There was no slow thawing process. There was no gentle reintroduction of oxygen, or the typical agonizing minutes of muscle spasms and sensory disorientation that accompanied standard cryogenic awakenings. The liquid inside the chamber boiled away into a dense, freezing vapor in a fraction of a second. Before the Valari crew could even raise their plasma rifles, a heavily augmented fist slammed into the inside of the thick, reinforced plasteel visor. The supposedly unbreakable glass webbed with massive cracks. A microsecond later, a second, devastating strike obliterated the barrier entirely. Shards of freezing plasteel exploded outward like shrapnel, forcing the scavengers to dive for the deck. From the billowing clouds of rapidly expanding vapor, Brant Benitez vaulted out of the shattered pod. He did not stumble. He did not cough or gasp for the sterile, freezing air. He landed on the metal grating in a low, predatory crouch, moving with the terrifying, explosive neural reflexes of a combat veteran laced with military-grade cybernetic enhancements. His synthetic muscle fibers fired with perfect, lethal efficiency, completely defying the physical atrophy expected from 20,000 years of suspended animation. He was a weapon drawn instantly from its sheath, lethal and fully operational the moment he opened his eyes. Yet, the human commander did not even cast a glance at the four heavily armed alien scavengers scrambling to their feet behind him. He completely ignored the very creatures who had just ripped him from his eternal slumber. Instead, Brant launched himself directly at the primary tactical oversight console located at the center of the dais. His scarred hands flew across the physical analog switches and holographic interfaces with blinding speed, bringing the dead monitors roaring back to life. The tactical readouts flooded the screens, bathing his face in a harsh, unforgiving red light. The Valari crew watched in silent terror as the expression on the face of this battle-hardened human shifted from cold, calculated readiness to absolute, paralyzing horror. The blood drained entirely from his weathered face. His jaw locked tightly as his eyes darted across the collapsing data streams. The primary containment interface was screaming in bright crimson letters. The metric designated as the anchor lock had plummeted drastically below the absolute minimum safety threshold. The invisible chain holding the universe together had just snapped. Brant whirled around, his eyes locking onto Xylar with a terrifying, uncontained fury. He closed the distance between them faster than the Valeri optical nerves could process. Before Xylar could even raise a defensive manipulator, Brant seized the heavy, armored chest plating of the alien engineer with a single hand and slammed him brutally against the nearest bulkhead. The impact dented the solid metal wall. Brant roared at him, his voice rough, unused, but carrying the weight of an apocalyptic command. The Valeri translation matrix struggled violently to process the ancient, guttural human dialect, the earpiece spitting out static before finally synthesizing the horrific truth. "What have you done?" Brant screamed, the sheer acoustic force of his voice rattling the helmets of the salvage team. "You just cut the power to the containment chain. You broke the seal." Xylar choked against the crushing grip, his mandibles flaring in panic. The terrible reality of their actions crashed down upon him. It was not the clumsy technician who had doomed them. It was Xylar himself. The concentrated tachyon laser pulse the void drifter had fired to shatter the camouflage bubble had not merely broken an optical illusion. That massive invisible sphere had been the delicate, foundational point of a 20,000-year-old quantum equilibrium. By violently piercing that outer shell, they had sent a cascading shockwave of unstable spatial distortion directly into the heart of the fleet formation. The impact had thrown the perfectly balanced gravitational tether out of alignment, and now the spatial rift was beginning to fracture. As if answering the human commander, a deafening, system-wide catastrophe alarm tore through the Aegis Prime. It was not a localized warning. It was the synchronized death scream of 400 dreadnoughts, simultaneously registering critical containment failure. The massive deck beneath their feet began to shudder violently, bucking and heaving as the internal gravitational dampeners fought a losing battle against a massive external anomaly. Outside the reinforced viewports, the cosmos itself began to scream. The spatial rift, the gaping wound in reality that the fleet had guarded for 20 millennia, was no longer convulsing silently. It was tearing open, expanding outward at an exponential, terrifying speed. The jagged edges of the artificial black hole fractured like brittle glass, the borders of normal space and time crumbling away into the void. From the deepest, most unfathomable depths of that expanding tier, something began to pull itself into the physical universe. It possessed no discernible form, no biological structure that any scanner could categorize. It was a massive, non-corporeal entity of pure, consuming darkness. It was the Devourer. The scavengers could only watch in absolute, mind-shattering terror as the entity slowly slithered colossal. Writhing tentacles made entirely of dense, dark matter through the bleeding hole in reality. Wherever those shadowy appendages touched the vacuum of space, the very fabric of the cosmos warped, sickeningly distorting the distant starlight as the creature prepared to feast upon a defenseless galaxy. The human commander recognized instantly that physical brute force and manual console overrides would not be fast enough to halt the cascading dimensional fracture happening outside. Recognizing that the immediate collapse of the surrounding space could not be reversed through conventional keystrokes, Brant violently released his crushing hold on Xylar. He shoved the alien engineer aside, letting him crumple to the cold deck, grating without a second glance. Brant rolled back the heavy, insulated sleeve of his left arm, exposing a terrifying network of metallic neural interface ports, surgically grafted directly into his flesh and nervous system. He slammed his bare arm down onto the exposed central command pedestal. Thick, biomechanical cables slithered upward from the ancient terminal, violently piercing his skin to fuse directly with his neural architecture. Brant arched his spine, his jaw locking tight as a localized surge of agonizing dreadnought tactical data flooded his organic brain. He was weaponizing his own mind, acting as a living processing relay to forcibly establish a temporary, highly localized containment barrier across the breached sector, desperately buying them a handful of minutes. As the primary systems underwent a massive, desperate reboot, bathing the bridge in a harsh, warning amber glow. Brant finally spoke to the scavengers. His voice was no longer a roar of immediate fury, but a low, bitter rasp that echoed heavily with the impossible weight of ages. "You fools look at us and see a lost expedition," he spat out. His eyes locked dead ahead on the holographic displays projecting the deteriorating rift. "You see refugees fleeing from a forgotten war, or a failed colonial fleet drifting in the dark. We never fled. We never got lost. This armada is not a stranded fleet. It is a maximum security cell." He turned his head slightly, his gaze piercing through the terrified Valeri crew. "We built this architecture to lock away that thing outside. It is not an invading alien army. It is a thermodynamic catastrophe, a localized anomaly that actively feeds on the very fabric of reality itself. If it breaches completely, it will not simply consume planets or burn star systems. It will erase the foundational laws of physics across the entire galaxy. Gravity, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear forces. All of it will unravel into pure, chaotic void. Matter will forget how to hold together." Brant paused, his chest heaving heavily as the brutal strain of the direct neural link pushed his cardiovascular system to its absolute limits. 20,000 years ago, my species reached its absolute zenith. We conquered our domain, eradicated disease, bent the stars to our will, and touched the very face of godhood. And then, we found that entity in the dark. He gestured toward the massive viewport with a trembling, cybernetic hand. When our greatest scientific minds realized it could not be killed, could not be reasoned with, and could not be destroyed by any weapon conceived in our reality, we made a choice. We took the 400 strongest, most advanced warships we had ever forged. We stripped them of their warp capabilities. We abandoned our golden age, our families, and our thriving homeworlds. We brought them out here to the absolute edge of nothingness, to form a perpetual, unbreakable energy loop. His voice cracked slightly, betraying a deep, agonizing sorrow buried beneath layers of tactical coldness. But we knew machines degrade. Even our greatest fusion reactors would eventually starve over millennia. So, we required a secondary, incorruptible power source. We needed an endless, organic battery. The entire crew of this fleet, tens of thousands of our absolute brightest and bravest souls, volunteered to be linked directly into the power grid. They willingly gave up their lives, turning their own nervous systems and bioelectrical fields into the living current that kept the chains tight. The alien scavengers listened, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing magnitude of the narrative. "I am the only one left with a beating heart," Brant continued, the heavy burden of his solitary rank pressing down upon every syllable. "I am the gatekeeper. I was systematically programmed to wake up intermittently across the endless millennia. A solitary ghost forced to walk among the calcified remains of my dearest friends, just to check the integrity of the locks. My only true purpose was to stand watch in the dark. If the seal ever showed signs of being breached from the outside by ignorant, greedy wanderers like yourselves, I was supposed to activate the total annihilation protocol, collapsing this entire sector into a supermassive singularity to ensure the entity remained permanently trapped." Xylar knelt heavily on the deck, his mind utterly shattered by the revelation. The entire cultural paradigm of the Valeri race was built upon profit, upon picking the bones of dead civilizations to fuel their own fleeting, insignificant comforts. They considered themselves the clever, adaptable survivors of a dangerous universe. But in the imposing shadow of this solitary human, Xylar felt nothing but overwhelming shame. His people were merely cosmic scavengers, rats scurrying in the ruins for scraps of metal. Meanwhile, these beings called humanity had willingly sacrificed their own glorious utopia, enduring the agonizing torture of absolute time and utter isolation, simply to act as the silent guardian gods for a galaxy that did not even know they existed. The sheer, insane willpower required to execute such a monumental sacrifice was a concept no Valeri could ever truly comprehend. But the time for silent awe had brutally expired. The central console emitted a terrifying, sustained flatline tone. The temporary neural barrier was already failing under the cosmic pressure. Brant coughed violently, a small line of crimson blood trickling from his nostril as the mental feedback intensified dangerously. "The localized shield is collapsing," he gasped, his fingers flying across the holographic projections with desperate speed. "I am trying to route emergency reserves from the main fusion core to patch the rift, but there is nothing left to draw from." The data scrolling across the main terminal screen confirmed the final, apocalyptic truth. The central energy core of the Aegis Prime reported a catastrophic depletion rate of exactly 98%. It was a completely dead husk. There was absolutely zero sufficient power remaining anywhere in the fleet to reactivate the primary containment shield. Through the massive reinforced viewport, the true horror of their absolute failure manifested completely. The chaotic, thrashing tendrils of dark matter had fully coalesced. The Devourer was no longer just a terrifying shadow lurking behind a tear in space. It was violently pulling itself into the physical realm, taking the unmistakable, overwhelming shape of a colossal, impenetrable black storm, preparing to wash away the universe entirely. The colossal black storm outside the viewport did not merely exist, it hungered. The Devourer unleashed its first offensive, radiating concentrated waves of pure dark matter that rippled through the vacuum like an oil slick on a dark ocean. When these corrosive tides struck the outermost dreadnoughts of the blockade, the incredibly dense dark metal armor simply dissolved into nothingness. Blinding white flashes of secondary internal detonations illuminated the void, completely soundless in the vacuum of space. The agonizing death throes of the outer warships signaled that the ancient chain of containment was finally snapping, link by fragile link. The synchronized red tethers connecting the fleet flickered and died, plunging entire sectors of the defensive formation into absolute, terrifying darkness. As the bridge of the Aegis Prime shook with the violent sympathetic feedback of the dying outer ships, Xylar forced himself up from the vibrating deck. The scavenger engineer realized the human technology, while magnificently scaled, was fundamentally archaic. "Commander!" Xylar shouted over the blaring klaxons, his voice tight with a sudden, desperate realization. "Your fusion reactors are completely dead, but my vessel is powered by something your people did not possess 20,000 years ago. The Void Drifter utilizes a localized antimatter engine core. It is fully charged and highly unstable. It generates an energy yield far beyond standard plasma or fusion." Brant did not hesitate for a single microsecond. He fed the Valeri engine specifications directly into his neural link, interfacing violently with the central artificial intelligence of the dreadnought. The archaic, tactical hololithic display flickered, running millions of combat simulations in a fraction of a second. "The artificial intelligence confirms a marginal probability of success," Brant announced, his voice locked into a state of pure tactical focus. "If we extract your antimatter core and manually splice it directly into the primary firing chamber of our central superparticle cannon, we can invert the polarity of the blast. Instead of firing a solid beam of thermal destruction, we will trigger a massive inverse spatial pulse. It will forcibly collapse the dimensional geometry around the tear, burying the entity alive in a permanent quantum singularity. But the integration must be done manually, down in the armory." There was no time to formulate a safer strategy. Brant and Xylar immediately evacuated the command bridge, sprinting through the umbilical docking tube back to the Valeri ship to rip the beating heart from its engineering bay. The antimatter core was a massive, cylindrical containment vessel weighing well over 2 metric tons. with the anti-gravity sleds on the human dreadnought completely failing. They had to rely on the brutal physical force of Brandt and his military-grade cybernetic enhancements, aided by Xylar, operating his heavy engineering exoskeleton suit, to physically drag the monstrous bomb deep into the bowels of the Aegis Prime. The journey down to the main artillery battery was a terrifying race against the rapidly collapsing structural integrity of the flagship. The massive deck plating beneath their boots buckled and cracked loudly under the cosmic stress. The artificial gravity generators began to glitch violently, randomly shifting the internal environment from crushing, multiplied weight to complete weightlessness every few seconds. They were violently tossed against the sparking bulkheads, bruising their bodies and draining their stamina as they desperately pushed the heavy, glowing core through the dark, failing corridors. They finally breached the heavy blast doors of the primary cannon convergence chamber, a massive cylindrical room lined with colossal magnetic focusing rings. But just as they pushed the heavy core toward the central firing mount, the thick outer hull of the dreadnought violently groaned and tore open. A localized dimensional breach occurred directly inside the artillery bay, and a terrifying, writhing tentacle of pure dark matter plunged directly into the room, reaching hungrily for the explosive antimatter cylinder. If that alien entity touched the core, the resulting annihilation would prematurely detonate the weapon, wiping out the ship before the pulse could ever be focused and fired. Without a single moment of hesitation, Brandt threw himself directly into the path of the anomaly. He planted his magnetic boots firmly to the deck grating, raised his heavy cybernetic arm, and physically caught the blunt force of the shadowy appendage. The sheer kinetic impact drove him backward, his metallic joints screaming in protest. The dark matter began to immediately eat away at his synthetic flesh, his augmented muscles burning as he used every ounce of his tremendous physical strength to hold back the fabric of the void. "Finish the splice!" Brandt roared through gritted teeth, his biological arm gripping his mechanical one to reinforce the physical block. "Wire it into the primary ignition relay right now." Xylar frantically stripped the thick power couplings, his sharp claws manipulating the delicate alien circuitry with desperate precision. He forcibly slammed the modern Valeri ignition nodes into the archaic human firing receptors, bypassing decades of safety protocols in a matter of intense seconds. The massive particle cannon hummed to life, the giant focusing rings spinning up with a deafening, ascending whine that vibrated deep in their chests. But just as the targeting matrix locked onto the dead center of the spatial tear outside, the primary console flashed a blinding, fatal error code in glaring red text. The technological incompatibility between the modern scavenger engine and the ancient human artillery system was simply too severe to bridge via basic software overrides. The automated remote firing sequence was completely dead. Xylar stared at the flashing readout, his heart sinking heavily into his stomach. The diagnostic explicitly stated that the digital handshake had completely failed. The weapon could absolutely not be discharged from the bridge, nor from any secure remote terminal on the ship. To unleash the inverse pulse, someone had to physically sit in the direct center of the main energy convergence chamber and manually crosswire the final ignition switch at the exact moment of critical mass. And doing so meant that whoever pulled the trigger would be caught precisely at the epicenter of a localized antimatter reaction, instantly and inevitably pulverized into subatomic ash before the beam even left the barrel. The realization of the fatal error code barely had time to reflect in the multifaceted eyes of the Valeri engineer before Brandt made his final tactical decision. There was absolutely zero hesitation, not even a single thousandth of a second of doubt in his movements. Brandt instantly dropped his defensive stance against the encroaching tendril of dark matter. He grabbed the heavy, armored exoskeleton of Xylar with his cybernetic arm, lifting the alien completely off the deck, and physically hurled him backward into the adjacent emergency evacuation bay. Before Xylar could protest, or even fully comprehend the monumental sacrifice unfolding in front of him. Brant smashed his organic fist onto the heavy emergency release console. He immediately established ultimate command override, sealing the thick blast doors of the pod and forcefully expelling the Volari salvage crew out into the freezing void on a high-velocity escape trajectory. Inside the artillery bay, the situation had escalated to truly apocalyptic proportions. The Devourer had now pulled 90% of its impossible, formless mass through the rapidly collapsing spatial rift. Its colossal silhouette completely obliterated the distant light of the stars, casting a shadow so profound it felt like a crushing physical weight upon the mind. The mere presence of the entity created a localized psychological pressure that threatened to completely shatter the sanity of any living creature. It simultaneously warped the geometric structure of the surrounding space into sickening, unnatural angles, threatening to rip the very fabric of reality to shreds. Brant turned his back on the cosmic nightmare thrashing outside the hull. He walked steadily and purposefully into the absolute center of the energy convergence chamber. The raw power of the spliced antimatter core was already building to critical mass, bathing the massive room in a blinding, searing white heat. Standing precisely at the focal point of certain subatomic annihilation, Brant tapped the side of his neck, hardwiring a direct, unbreakable communication channel straight to the fleeing Volari escape pod. Despite the unimaginable horror tearing his ancient ship apart around him, his voice echoed through the comms of the terrified scavengers with an incredibly strange, peaceful clarity. You could hear the faint, resolute smile in his words as he delivered his final transmission. The 20,000-year watch ends here. Please tell the galaxy that humanity never gave up. With those final words hanging in the air, Brant Benitez slammed both hands onto the exposed manual ignition relays. The highly volatile, futuristic engineering of the Volari scavengers forcefully collided with the ancient, unyielding siege weaponry of mankind. The resulting catastrophic reaction generated a terrifying beam of pure, incandescent white light that completely shattered every known physical law. The energy pulse tore straight through the heavy dark metal armor of the Aegis Prime, slicing the oppressive cosmic darkness in half, and violently pierced the absolute dead center of the spatial wound. What followed was not an explosion of outward destruction, but a magnificent, terrifying implosion. A localized singularity of absolute inverse gravity blossomed brilliantly at the heart of the rift. The fabric of space violently churned and folded inward upon itself. The Devourer unleashed a silent, dimension-shattering shriek as the impossible crushing force of the reversed pulse gripped its dark matter form. The entity was brutally crushed, compressed, and violently dragged backward against its will, banished entirely back into the chaotic void from which it had originally crawled. As the monster was swallowed whole by the singularity, the violently distorted region of space aggressively snapped shut. The tear collapsed inward, sealing the wound completely. Within moments, the turbulent cosmic ocean settled, becoming as perfectly flat and tranquil as a totally undisturbed lake of glass. Millions of miles away, the Volari escape pod drifted safely in the silent dark. Xylar pressed his face against the small viewing port, his breath catching heavily in his throat. When he looked back toward the coordinates of the quantum graveyard, there was no wreckage to be found. The Aegis Prime, along with the entire armada of 400 proud human warships, had been completely vaporized by the sheer magnitude of the inverse pulse. They had not left behind a single piece of twisted metal or drifting debris. Instead, the entire fleet had been beautifully converted into a massive, swirling cloud of fiercely glowing, luminescent dust. It hung in the absolute silence of the void, glittering brightly in the dark like a perfectly contained, miniature galaxy, restoring absolute peace to that sector of the universe. Many years after that fateful encounter, Xylar stood rigidly before the grand podium of the Galactic Council, the highest governing body in the known universe. He did not speak of salvage rights, forgotten technologies, or profitable trade routes. Instead, he simply activated a small playback device, broadcasting the final, calm recording of Brant Benitez to the tens of thousands of assembled alien delegates. On that day, the name of the species known as humanity was permanently erased from the historical database of forgotten cosmic trash. Their name, and the epic story of their unimaginable sacrifice, was carved deep into the towering, indestructible monument at the absolute center of the civilized universe. They became the eternal symbol of ultimate protection, representing a level of extraordinary bravery that would never be forgotten until the end of time. Thank you so incredibly much to every single listener tuning in to our story today. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please drop your location in the comments below. If you found today's journey into the stars thrilling and deeply moving, we kindly ask for your help. With our channel currently stripped of its monetization by the platform, we desperately need your support to keep the lights on. A humble contribution of just $1 makes an absolutely massive difference. It directly allows us to pay our incredibly hard-working staff, helping them feed their families and ensuring we can continue crafting these epic adventures for you. You can easily support us by scanning the donation QR code right there on your screen, or by clicking the secure donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next story.